Come on, this is the last, this is the show ending. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. There we go. My name is Don Brunson, and I'm the Assistant Dean of the Graduate School and also the Director of the Enhancing Diversity in Graduate Education Program. We are happy to have you join us for the Graduate School panel for this symposium. So when we were tasked with assembling a panel, I thought to myself, we are a graduate education, so there's going to be, the representation of the different schools, of course, with education and Peabody and religion and divinity, and of course, legal perspectives from law school. So I said, who are our clients? And I thought they are the persons that we are trying to develop as the next generation of scholar leaders. So with that in mind, I called upon old friends to say, hey, I need your help. I think that you would make a wonderful panelist, and I think that you would have perspectives and a viewpoint that will be of interest to a prospective audience who are going to be the next generation of fighters in the struggle. So at this point, I will introduce my panelists. First is Dr. Camille Burge. Dr. Camille Burge is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and visiting faculty in the Center for Peace and Justice Education at Villanova University. She was born in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and raised in Alpharetta, Georgia. Prior to joining Villanova in the fall of 2014, she received her Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from Bethune-Cookman University and a Master's and PhD in Political Science from Vanderbilt University. As a graduate student at Vanderbilt, Camille received the prestigious National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, and in 2014, she received the Lucius Barker Award for the Best Paper on Race and Politics at the annual meeting of the Midwest Political Science Association. In 2018, she was awarded the Junior Faculty Award for Excellence in Teaching at Villanova University. Camille's research interests lie at the intersection of political psychology and racial and ethnic politics. Motivated by her personal experiences as an African American growing up in the sprawling suburbs of Atlanta, she studies how individuals experience emotions as members of groups and how these experiences shape their policy opinions and political behavior. Her research has been published in the Journal of Politics and Research and Politics, and her book manuscript, Fired Up, Ready to Go, Pride, Shame, and Anger in Black Politics, is currently under review for publications. Dr. Frank E. Dobson Jr. is an Associate Dean of Students, Social Justice and Identity at Vanderbilt University. His publications include 2 novels, Rendered Invisible and The Race Is Not Given, which address such issues as rational suicide and racially motivated violence. Dr. Dobson has published scholarly works in Black literatures as well as poetry and short fiction. Most recently, he has published articles on film and race, examining such figures as the pioneering Black actor Woody Strode, as well as issues of Blackness and whiteness in the works of film directors Clint Eastwood and Spike Lee. And finally, Dr. Gilman Whiting is an associate professor and director of graduate studies for African American and diaspora studies here at Vanderbilt. He directs the Scholarly Identity Institute and the Black Male Initiative at Vanderbilt also. His areas of research include educational disparity, special and gifted education, sociology of race, sports and American culture, research methods, Black activism, and fatherhood initiatives. Dr. Whiting has authored more than 60 scholarly articles in journals such as the Roper Review, the Journal of Secondary Gifted Education, and the International Journal of Sports and Society, as well as numerous book chapters. In 2006, Dr. Whiting reconceptualized his dissertation on young Black and brown fathers and created the Scholarly Identity Model, trademark, in psychosocial model to assist whole communities to rethink ways to combat academic apathy. He consults with hundreds of school districts and programs nationally and internationally. He is the founding chair of the Achievement Gap Institute at the George W. Peabody College of Education at Vanderbilt. So, to begin our discussion of from MLK to Black Lives Matter, 50 years in the struggle. Since Dr. Burge is beginning, I thought that I would open the discussion by talking about anger. And my whole point is that the mood of the country will follow, to some point, its leader. If we think back to 1968, we had, of course, President LBJ, who is known for signing the Civil Rights Act, but more importantly, for lots of us, he was also responsible for escalating the war in Vietnam, in which many black, brown, and folks from poor neighborhoods were sent away to Southeast Asia to fight a war. And that had a lasting impact with respect to, post-traumatic stress disorders and drug usage in urban centers, followed by President Richard Nixon, who not only escalated the war in Vietnam, but also extended that war into Cambodia and Laos. Again, you have the urban areas, urban neighborhoods, losing thousands and thousands of young men from their population. He was followed by President Jimmy Carter, who was known for his work in civil rights, but will also be remembered for the horrible economic conditions that resulted toward the end of his presidency. And to continue something that many folks might have forgotten, it was during the last part of his presidency that he reestablished the selective service process, which means that, and I was in that first group, don't calculate my age, I was in that first group that had to sign up for selective service and to ensure that it's done, it's attached to things like your financial aid, et cetera. So while I was listening to a commercial on the radio this morning talking about it's your civic duty, no, we don't have a choice. If you don't do it, it's going to be some really bad consequences. Carter was followed by Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics, which, of course, one of the first things that Ronald Reagan did was lower the tax rates on the very wealthy and therefore widen the economic gap between the very rich and those who were not rich, such that to this day those gaps can never, ever be reestablished. And also, Reagan is also responsible for escalating the war on drugs, which of course was started back in '71 with Nixon, but also you can remember the escalation of crack cocaine, which was very attractive, which was a very attractive, inexpensive form of cocaine, which took over many urban areas. The backlash from that was George H.W. Bush with his kinder, gentler America. The backlash from the meanness of the Reagan years. Of course, with Bush, we had the Iraq War, but there was a lot of anger that was built up due to the cultural wars. Remember those toward the end, Dan Quayle arguing with Murphy Brown. But Bush had to do this to pull in the right. Then we had the good President Bill Clinton, who brought economic good news, but was also responsible for signing bills resulting in mass incarceration. So with all the good news, there's also the bad news, and again, building up with a lot of black anger. Then we had Bush II with his compassionate conservatism, which brought us to the second Iraq War, and also with the war in Afghanistan. So now you have, again, you have more folks being sent off to war, and more, again, disparities in the communities. And at the end of his term was the complete economic collapse. Finally, almost finally, leading us to President Obama. Again, some good news, but one of the things that folks forget is that President Obama was responsible for massive deportations under his watch. Again, there's some good news and bad news. And now we have our current president. So to discuss anger, we will turn it over to Dr. Burge, and she will discuss political anger and its relationship to the theme of this forum.
So thank you for inviting me back here to speak today. And since the topic is about struggle, I thought I'd just mention that I had a 6-year struggle on this campus to receive my master's and PhD, but here we are on the other side of victory and glory. Hiya. Back to the theme for this panel. So the struggle of Black people for the last 50 years is about the same as it's been for the last 153 years, since 1865. And I think that struggle at its root is simply this: it's unequal treatment. And I hate to boil it down to something so simplistic, but that is the thread that's run through all of the commentary that we've been talking about here today, and that thread is about equality. All that Black people have been asking for is equality. And so what I'm hoping to address in the time that I have is how unequal treatment manifests in different emotions. But I'm going to focus primarily on anger, and then how we might go about using that anger, much like our ancestors did, to progress as a new generation of freedom fighters. So we're going to talk about the emotional aspect first. I study political psychology and racial and ethnic politics in the United States. And specifically, I examine how we experience emotions as members of groups and what that means for our public opinion and political decision making. So we should start by talking about anger. What is anger? And I'm so glad that you're still awake at this panel and that you asked. And there seems to be a whole lot of that going on right now. Richard Lazarus defined anger as a belief that we or our friends have been unfairly slighted, which causes in us both painful feelings and a desire or impulse for revenge. Anger is a negative emotion, wherein blame for undesirable behavior and resulting undesirable events is directed at another person or group. And so what makes anger a distinct emotion is that we're able to attribute blame to the person that's causing anger, but the reason that we become angry is because we believe that the person that caused the offense could have chosen an alternative source of action, right? That of all the things that they could have done, they chose to offend you. And so that is what produces the anger inside of us. And in terms of action tendencies, anger produces a desire to regain control, remove the obstruction, and if necessary, attack the source of injury. So let's just say that you're driving down the street and someone cuts you off. You get angry because you know it was the driver who cut you off and they didn't have to do so, but they did it anyways. So what do? You might honk your horn. You might drive a little recklessly behind them to let them know you're offended. I live in Philadelphia right now, so those streets are especially hard, but we've all been there. So let's bring this back to race because we're talking about the struggle for the last 50 years. In the 1960s, two Black psychiatrists, William Greer, who is actually the father of comedian David Allen Greer, and Price Cobbs were trying to understand what led to the Watts riots and other urban unrest around the United States. In their book, Black Rage, which was published in 1968, they state, "The culture of slavery was never undone from either master or slave. The civilization that tolerated slavery dropped its slaveholding cloak, but the inner feelings remained. The peculiar institution continues to hold its evil influence over the nation. The practice of slavery stopped over 100 years ago, but the minds of our citizens have never been freed." End quote. So they argue that the reason that Black people in the United States are angry, and remember this book is published 50 years ago, is because of whites' inability to treat them as equals. The authors suggested that the unequal treatment of African Americans by white people in America, along with continued discrimination, was fueling their anger and was motivating subsequent protests. And so what we've done in America as it pertains to racial issues is constantly throw policies at them without getting to the heart of the issue. So let's try to make this a little bit more plain. We can't just have legislation to support funding for more body cameras for police, and then on the back end, wonder why Black people are still getting shot at roughly 20 times the rate of their white counterparts. It's because we haven't dealt with the real issue. We haven't dealt with why you might perceive someone to be perhaps more prone to criminality or perhaps more suspicious. We've just given you a camera to now record the justifiable encounter. And so these scholars found that it was anger that fueled the urban unrest. And as you might imagine, continued discrimination against Black people in the aftermath of legislation designed to ensure equality led many Black people to feel angry in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And of course, we can draw parallels between the anger experienced by Black people in the 1960s to those faced by many today. Even after the election of the first self-identified Black man to the presidency of the United States, discrimination against Black people still abounds in political, social, and economic spheres. A cursory glance at the headlines of newspapers or evening news support the notion that many Black people are angry at the police shooting of both Black men and women that seem to be motivated by implicit bias. Blacks are also angry at bias in the criminal justice system that tends to disproportionately penalize people of color more harshly than their white counterparts for the same offenses. We're angry at photo ID to vote laws that are here to dilute the African American vote. And so there seems to be a great deal of anger in the Black community in present day that stem from the findings, again, of Greer and Cobbs in 1968. This is 50 years ago, that Black people were still angry at the continued unequal treatment as citizens in the United States of America. And this is a finding, I think, that's most recently underscored by the Black Lives Matter movement. So in the political psychology literature, we know that anger is a powerful, motivating emotion. It motivates people to engage in the political arena in various ways, one of the most common being both protest and demonstration, but another of those being voting. So I just want us to consider three things that we might consider doing again as we move forward as freedom fighters. The first is to get organized, the second is to vote, and the third is to hold elected officials accountable. So first, we need to get organized. Black people and their allies need to get organized. When you compare movements that were successful to those that were not, some of the key differences are the organizational apparatus, clear lines of leadership and bureaucratic responsibility, committees that have been designed to serve various purposes, clear goals. So what are the goals of this march? What do we actually want? What is the tangible outcome that we're hoping for? So then we can measure progress. Second, we need to identify the politicians that share our goals and vote for them. We need to collectively vote for these individuals, and this applies to incumbents and challengers. In The Ballot or the Bullet, Malcolm X gave it to us. He said back then, white voters are going to split almost evenly for Republicans and Democrats, and the next largest voting coalition is Black people. If we are to vote our interests collectively, we can exercise a great deal of political power. And the third is holding elected officials accountable. So don't just vote and forget that you put someone in office. Watch their actions. What are they supporting while they're in there? If it's not what you want them to do, vote for someone else next time. There's no one in this room that would be able to keep their jobs if they constantly worked against the interests of their company and their bosses. In America, it's consent of the governed. The people in America are the only legitimate fountain of power, and we are the people that have the power to change it. So we have to take our emotions, especially the anger that we might be feeling, and channel them into our political processes. So thank you for my extended time and for allowing me to speak. And of course, I look forward to any questions that you might have during the Q&A.
Thank you. So to continue on this discussion of anger, we're all aware of the large number of shootings and killings of unarmed Black folks, but there's still some little-known killings that happened in the 1980s that clearly link up with the movements of today, like Black Lives Matter. And to talk more about some of them is Dr. Frank Dobson.
Great. Thank you so much. I realize you're going to do that little beep beep thing, so I'm going to read fast, bro. I'm going to read fast.
That wasn't me, that was the phone.
Thank you so much for your paper. It really sets mine up quite well. As you were talking, I wrote on my notes Greer and Cobbs, and then you started talking about them. And I was thinking also about the Marvin Gaye classic, Makes Me Want to Holler, you know, internally and externally. I'm going to read a little bit from the paper, and there's some personal stuff in here. And I'll say this, as you were talking, I was taking some additional notes, and for me, The flip side of anger is a kind of abiding sadness, if you will, and how does one deal with a heinous history that I'm still grappling with, quite frankly, how to cope personally, how to not cry, how to handle the tears, and I hope I get to that point where I talk about that with my children. In 1910, I wrote a book entitled Rendered Invisible. It's a work of historical fiction based upon a true story in my hometown of Buffalo, New York. In the fall of 1980 in Buffalo, there was a serial killer by the name of Joseph Christopher who killed 13 black men in upstate New York and New York City. In Buffalo, he was known as a .22 caliber killer. In New York City, he was known as the Midtown Slasher. The killing spree actually happened at a time when I was not living at home, but I was getting ready to go home for something, and my parents said, "Don't come home right now, Frankie," because they're killing black people in the streets. So I want to talk about the book and the story and the way in which it affected me personally. And so I also want to talk about a couple of books that helped me process as I was writing the book. One of them is the classic book, I think it's a classic, Those Bones Are Not My Child by the late, great Tony K. Bombara on the Atlanta child murders. And it's interesting when I talk with young people about the Atlanta child murders that began in '79 and ended in '81, and these murders in Buffalo and upstate New York and New York State were in 1980. That sometimes young people, even from Atlanta, and I mentioned Atlanta child murders, and they go, "What? Huh?" And I'm thinking, we haven't begun to continue to transmit the history. The other thing, the other book that I used when I was writing my book that really inspired me, because Bombara's book is a tour de force, and she documents, amazing stuff in the book, is John Edgar Wideman's book, Philadelphia Fire, which really is looking at the bombing of the MOVE compound in Philadelphia, where there was a standoff between the city of Philadelphia and a group of African Americans known as MOVE, and there was a standoff between them and the police, and I lived in Pennsylvania around that time, actually, and not in Philly, but I can remember when that happened. That the irony of it is that there was an African-American mayor, the first black mayor of Philadelphia, by the name of Wilson Goode, who gave the okay to then Police Commissioner Rizzo to drop a bomb on a row home in Philly where there were people, children, folks. And the irony of it is, again, someone from New York State, New York City, and lived all over the East Coast. Y'all know what happens when you drop a bomb on a row home. It just doesn't affect that home. So the whole neighborhood was devastated. And for young people who may not believe that you would drop a bomb on a neighborhood, I brought some information. But and you can Google it. But in writing the book, Rendered Invisible, I was able to take inspiration from those accounts. I'll say this about Rendered Invisible. It happened in 1980. The first victim was a 14-year-old black boy by the name of Glenn Dunn, who was sitting in a parked car. The serial killer, later found out to be Joseph Christopher, shot him in the head. Subsequent victims were shot in the head crossing the street, shot in the head sitting in parked cars, in supermarkets, what have you. There were a couple of cabbies whose bodies were found mutilated on the shores of Lake Erie. This is all true stuff, and the irony of it is that nobody knows about the killings. I want to read just one quick portion from the book that doesn't deal with the killings, but deals with sort of how the black community was grappling with the killings. And the timeline is Wednesday, October 1st, 1980. So this is about a month into this killing spree. The FBI enters the investigation at the request of the black community, I might add, because according to U.S. Attorney Richard De Arcara, the civil rights of two of the victims may have been violated because the killer interfered with their right to public accommodations. One victim was shot in a restaurant and one in the supermarket parking lot. The locales of the shootings allowed the authorities to use the old civil rights legislation from the sit-ins to bring the feds into the case. This legislation links the Buffalo violence to the 60s struggles when blacks in the South integrated lunch counters, soda fountains, and any other facility which serves the public and is principally engaged in selling food and beverages. For Buffalo blacks, walking on the street, eating a hamburger and fries had become gestures of courage, acts against fear and paranoia, which linked the city with the struggles of the past when young blacks sat down at lunch counters knowing they would be beaten, spat upon, jailed. Now we knew we might just die for being black. According to police, a white man in the neighborhood where one of the shootings happened said to a black woman, "You're next," or "You're going to get it," and then fled. By this point in the investigation, the police have gotten over 200 calls and tips, including one from a man who identified himself as the killer. And there's another where, according to the media, a wife called the cops to say that she thought her husband was the killer, but she refused to give his identity. So there's paranoia in town by this point. This is an election year, 1980. George Bush Sr. comes to town on behalf of Ronald Reagan. Jesse Jackson comes to town. There are reprisals against whites. There's cross burnings. My hometown is blowing up and is very, very much in chaos. And I can't tell you more of the story now because I want to get to sort of the end of my paper. And I want to pick up with something that happened in 2001. Some of you may be familiar with the shooting of Timothy Thomas. In 2001, there was an unarmed African-American young man, 19 years old, who had some parking tickets. There was a white cop who saw him, recognized the license plate, gave chase. Thomas ran, was shot in the chest, and died. The city of Cincinnati was in flames. And again, I lived in Dayton at the time. The Thomas story I'm reading now is personal to me because I can remember a time when, and this was before the Thomas shooting, when I was in Cincinnati with two of my three children. They were probably, Jasmine may have been 10 and Corey was 6, and I was teaching a night class as an adjunct at a school in Cincinnati. And I went into the classroom and the kids kind of played in the car, which was really close by. Or they were with me and they were in the car waiting for me or something. And I was racially profiled by a cop. And I can remember the children sitting in the car as I'm trying to drive off, and the cop is accosting me, and they're starting to cry, and they're thinking, what's going on here? What are you doing to our dad, right? And I can remember that they were frightened for me as they witnessed the confrontation, as I was frightened for them. And so the interesting thing was, my child, Jasmine, said at that point, Dad, we don't ever want to come back to Cincinnati. You know, like, it's the place. That's the problem. And the interesting thing that happened in terms of the Timothy Thomas affair, if you will, is that it was the latest in a string of killings of young blacks by cops in Cincinnati. So the city went up in flames that time. I'm going to kind of end the paper with an even more personal, or just as personal note. During my time at Vanderbilt, I've maintained a home in Beaver Creek, Ohio. Some of you may know that Beaver Creek, Ohio was another one of those places that has become infamous because of the shootings. John Crawford, young black man, walking in a Walmart with a BB gun, shot and killed. It's around the corner from Wright State University, where I worked for like 16 years. My wife and I still own a home in Beaver Creek, and my wife knows that if you go shopping in that Beaver Creek Walmart, I will not set foot in there. I have not since they killed him. I can't go in there. Can't go in there. Will never go in there. And I think about that because I wonder about the whole question, when you talk about anger and rage and madness and sadness, how do we cope with this psychically? I don't know, quite frankly, if I coped well with my children who were crying as they were watching the cop verbally assault me and threaten to tear my car apart, you know, and tow it. I don't know, for example, even in terms of some of the other things when I've talked with young people on this campus, if I'm always saying the right thing or listening long enough. And so when you talk about anger, I also think about the psychic cost to all of us. So I think I want to end on that note with one other thing that when I went back to Buffalo and talked about the book when the book first came out, Rendered Invisible, a young man came up to me who said my uncle was one of the victims of the .22 caliber killer. And he thanked me and he said, I've been trying for 30 years because the killings happened in '80 and this was like 2010 or so, to say something about that. And so one of the things that I think I want to suggest, and I'm going to end on this point, is that we really have to be so cognizant of and so charitable to one another as we're grappling in times like these, Dr. Brunson. And I have a colleague and a friend who, just like I can't go into that Walmart ever, has told me that there's a building on our campus named Confederate Memorial Hall, or was called Confederate Memorial Hall. We took the word Confederate off the pediment, and he said when it was there, he would never go in, and he still cannot go in, and I don't question him. Because again, I think as we talk about anger and we talk about rage and we talk about this legacy that you so eloquently talked about, Doc, it's a deep, rich legacy. It's a legacy of pain, it's a legacy of loss, and it's a legacy of struggle. And I think as we continue to struggle and as struggle continues, I think we have to continue to tell those stories, to be charitable to one another, and to recognize that this struggle just keeps on continuing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Russell. So with these issues of anger and disenfranchisement, the question becomes, how do we move forward? And to offer some words on that is Dr. Gilman Whiting.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you all for sticking around. Those who were there this morning saw the fire and brimstone and trying to keep it going from the, School of Religion and then the law school. They came on and they were good as well, and then education folks. So we're going to try to wrap it up and keep you awake for a second. So I want to jump around a little bit. I'll try to bring it back at the end, I promise. And as I sat here today, I thought about the period of time in which we're discussing that period of time from the 50-year time stretch. And it's very easy for folks to start off American history with black folks with slavery. And being somewhat of a historian, I just think we all need to understand how things came to be. Brother Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not sprung into who he was by himself. Right? And as I sit here in this room, and I have a class called Black Masculinity, where we're right down the hall using the actual law room in there, and they're actually adjudicating cases that I work with death row inmates down in Holman Correctional Facility down in Alabama. And as we go through some of those cases and we talk about it, I think about just, and this almost comes from one of those P90X things that you get ready to die, and the guy just says, take in the fact that you just did that. But I want us to take in the fact that we are sitting here right now, because this has not always been the case in this place. Just by show of hands, Charles Hamilton Houston, familiar with the name? Okay, 1.5 hands, okay. One hand went up and a half hand went up. Okay, so 2 now. I get 3. Anyway, so Charles Hamilton Houston is somebody we need to know because he was the mentor of Thurgood Marshall. And he died, he was the architect of the Brown v. Board of Education. He led that thing. And this being a graduate school panel, most of his cases were actually done with involving getting graduate students into the universities, law schools and things like that, St. Louis being one. And his efforts then, after winning a series of cases, and very strategically picked cases that they could win so they could move it to the next level. Before he died, he wanted to see the integration of the K-12 system. And he had a heart attack, a massive heart attack, just a couple of years before Brown v. Board of Education. But he handed it off to Thurgood Marshall, which ushered him through. Now, going back to Morehouse, where Dr. Martin Luther King did his undergraduate years, there was a man there by the name of Dr. Benjamin E. Mays. And Dr. Benjamin E. Mays says this poem, and I'll try to get it right this time, so don't say anything. That's the end of the day for me, too. So I only have a minute. There's only 60 seconds in it. Forced upon me, I can't refuse it. I didn't seek it, I didn't choose it. But it's up to me to use it. I must suffer if I lose it, give an account if I abuse it. Only 60 little seconds, but there's an eternity in it. He talked about the very necessary thing of time. We're only here for a short amount of time. Charles Hamilton Houston here for a short period of time. Martin Luther King, who was the spiritual son to the intellectual father of Benjamin E. Mays. All of these connections are there. So as we see King who has been, I want to use this word, whitewashed. We celebrate King in January with the I Have a Dream speech they should celebrate it with the Two Americas speech. The other America he talks about. And that's something you can find now readily on YouTube. I encourage everybody to go look at it because he talks about not America as we see it in I Have a Dream and our 4 little children sitting together and all that. Because at the same time and after that, we have bombs going off in churches. And the thing that changed, I tell people the thing that changed about Katrina, here's one of my jumping around, right? The thing that changed about Katrina was this thing right here, the cell phone. Oh, I forgot to stop my time. I don't want to get that little beeper thing either.
No. Beeper is silenced.
Okay, I'm going to go down to 5 minutes, so I'll just end it there. So, the thing about Katrina was that there was always poor folk there. There was always poor schooling there. There were always these over-policing going on there. What the hurricane did was actually wet a lot of people and put a flashlight on the indignities that were happening in America. These cell phones and these other mass media, social media movements coming into Black Lives Matter, give us the ability to transmit these images instantly around the world. When the riot happened in Watts, when Rodney King happened in 1991 in California, it was about a week later where they were starting to do things in Boston and Rhode Island. I was there, I was working with the NAACP at the time. So I do know how slow that happened. Today, if something happened, we'd be tweeted it. If we could get a word in edgewise with your president, but we'd tweet it, and we do all these other kind of stuff to get that word and that message out there. So that has changed. What I want to look at now is something that happened not too long ago. It was probably 2009, so I guess it was some time ago. There was a professor in the School of Management. His name was Ray Friedman, and it was just after the election of Barack Obama. And what he was saying is that study sees an Obama effect lifting the scores of test takers. Now, eventually, that might be the case, but it was way too soon. And me and my educated mind knew that you need way more data than a year to tell me that somebody's tests are going. Matter of fact, these guys were already in college, so they're already resilient in certain kind of ways. Now, my daughter, who was 8 years old at the time, spent her next 8 years watching a black man and a black woman and 2 black girls like herself and a black dog in the White House, right? So there was an effect for her because she knew now that there was no roof over her head that she couldn't go, that breaking that glass ceiling type thing. But the fact that this researcher wanted to capitalize on the moment is what we do, and then it goes away. The construction of an activist. The activist that we saw during the 1960s was definitely a product of the time, if you think about it. The product of our time now, how does that work? Who was going to be like Brother Muhammad Ali the day he wins the heavyweight title, change his name to Muhammad Ali and become one of the most hated men in America? Who is today's going to do that? Who is going to do like Clarksville's Wilma Rudolph when she wins the gold medal in the Olympics, come home to Clarksville and say that we're going to have this ticker tape parade, but it's going to be segregated? She said, well, I'm not going to be there. And it was the first integrated parade in Clarksville. Who amongst us and graduate students is going to do that right now? Who's going to take a knee like Colin Kaepernick is doing today? So we have to think about the impact of what we're fighting for with regards to integration. Integration has gotten the graduate student today a very focused person you'd have to be, but has gotten to a point where he or she or they actually will not risk what they were risking back when. Grassroots movements have started outside of the university as well as inside the university. I'm challenged to think that what does that activist, what will it take today to get somebody to act out that way? Are the students today less hungry than they were in 1967, 68, and 69 when things were going on as they were? Are they less hungry? Are they more cautious? Are they worried about if they become like John Lewis at Fisk University, or they become like the Reverend Lawson, who was here at the law school? Are they worried about desegregating the lunch counters? Are they willing to have that mass collective movement that is there? Brother Brunson mentioned the scholar identity model, which is some of my work, And my 8th construct of that is race consciousness. And I'll end it with this. Race consciousness for me is something that I feel that so many of our teachers miss out on. We, the professors today, are only here because of the fighting from the students who were undergraduates at the time in the 1960s. We, as a program here at Vanderbilt, African American Diaspora Studies, is 50 years old next year. And we're only here because there were students who wanted a curriculum that reflected them. We're only here because the students said, not only want the curriculum, but we want the faculty that are here. Now we're in a very post kind of struggle time frame where students have become, oh, it's just common to see faculty like us somewhere. And so the struggle, the fight to see those folks doesn't appear to be there right now. So the Black Lives Matter moment does exist inside the institution, or is it something that's still out as a hashtag out in the world out there? I'm sure I piqued some ideas in your head. I do want to say lastly that I had a conversation with one of my friends and graduate students. We talked about this notion of Ujima, which is one of the days of Kwanzaa, but also means collective work and responsibility, collectivism. We went from a place of collectivism to almost a place of individualism / capitalism. So we're more concerned about our own selves. We're looking now at mirrors instead of looking out the window to see what's happening. And I'll stop with that.
Thank you. So Dr. Whiting,
Man, sir.
with the, you touched on the issue of, actually it's a combination of all of them. For example, Dr. Burge talked about there are issues of anger with, among black graduate students, but there's also this hesitation. There's a different, there's a different level of activism among the African American students, and in general, the Vanderbilt Graduate Student Council, who I nickname them, they're tough. They see something wrong, they let us know. And they let us know in no uncertain terms. Whereas there's hesitation among the black students, and I think it's, to some level, it's rooted in fear of retaliation. I've gotten this far, what happens if someone retaliates? What advice could you or Dr. Burge or Dr. Dobson provide? Because they are, what happens in the next group of black graduate students is going to be a function of what these folks do. Yes. And if they choose to say, I can't really, then how does the struggle move forward?
I wonder if they're not indeed more traumatized based upon what you're talking about with the Trump administration and the current moment. And I forgot to say this, I just read it today or yesterday, is that there are actually some people in Philadelphia who want to name a street for Wilson Good. They want to name a street for this brother. And I'm like, but he gave the okay to drop a bomb
On a row house.
on our neighborhood. I understand, first black mayor of Philadelphia. That's wonderful, but maybe you don't name a street for somebody who gave the okay to drop a bomb. But I want to get back to the whole question of traumatized, because in dealing with black graduate students on this campus, I went to a function with a black graduate student who's a PhD student who came here, had an Ivy League undergraduate experience, and came from inner city like myself, and we bonded, done a lot of things together, gone North Nashville and had chicken and just, enjoyed ourselves. But there are times when I know, based upon what he's come through and the fact that the road has been really tough for him, when I have to exercise kind of a militant tenderness, because I understand the trauma and the anger and the feeling that he's even said to me, I don't know if they want me to finish, Doc. And so I'm going to throw that out to y'all, because that whole question of anger, I'm there. But I also know that for me, as I'm working with these young people, I feel like sometimes, well, you're still dealing with trauma. So
one thing I think we have to consider is that we are in a social media activism phase, where And that becomes almost insular in kind of ways, but collective on a bigger outside of the world, outside of the door. Understanding their collective power is something I think that graduate students we talk about need to have. How does one who has gone through the K-12 plus system for the last 15 years or so, plus years, who have now been never having to take a class in Black culture, multicultural education, the history of the native or indigenous people to this land, and be created into a certain kind of ideology. I want to evoke somebody's name here as we talk about ancestors and folks like that, and that is Dr. William H. Cosby. Not the one we're worried about today, but the one back in the night. That's Bill Cosby, for those who don't know. Back in the 1970s, who was a very much an activist kind of person. And he said that if you look America directly in the eye, you're going to get a black eye. He said, because if you're educated in the American K-12 system, you're going to be educated to be a racist, and oftentimes against yourself. By the time you get to the college and university level, you're really only concerned about yourself. So when you get to that point, we're like, okay, I am here. When I graduate, I'm going to get a piece of paper from this place, and only my name is going to be on it. I'm not going to risk who I am or what I'm going to get to fight for this thing. Undergraduates do it all the time. They'll tell you to kiss their backside in a minute and just go on with it, right? But when you get to that graduate school level, you know, every word you say, because you know, we're talking about hazing, and anyway, there's a whole other thing that goes along with being a graduate student too. So.
Not going to speak too much on it. I got my paper and I'm out. No, I'm just kidding.
That's right.
I think there's a lot of, like when I was in graduate school, so coming from undergrad, I went to a historically Black college, Bethune-Cookman, now university, and I was so active. I was president of the NAACP. We're out here marching. We're out here doing all these things. It's my first time after growing up in the suburbs that I had taken any African-American history courses, you know, and learned anything about Black people pre-slavery. Aside from my parents, who really tried to give Malcolm X at home all the kinds of different readings that we had on the table and tell us all these other things, and they're here too. But I think when you're in graduate school, you're just trying to survive. And stereotype threat is real. When you're thinking about some of the work by Claude Steele, Whistling Vivaldi, there are a lot of different internalized pressures that you place on yourself when you get here. There's a lot going on within your cohort in terms of people like making comments either to your face or behind your back. Some individuals also have to deal with faculty that might have some implicit and explicit bias issues. And so I know for me, when I was in graduate school, I was going to church and trying to stay prayed up so I could finish these degrees. But I think that there's just something that there's a big, tremendous struggle that you're trying to overcome while you're in graduate school, and there's a lot of different forces that are coming at you. And I know for me personally, as someone who was extremely active and marching and leading different things, and then coming here and just not doing any of those things, it in part was just me trying to cope and manage like workload and also manage personalities. So I remember the first thing that I did on campus when I got here was a teaching demo. So you have to go to like RATA training the week before school starts. If you're a graduate student here, at least they did back when I was here. So you have to do these teaching demonstrations. And so I went to Kinko's. I had copies of everything. I was like, I am ready for my 7-minute teaching demo. We're going to talk about symbolic representation and descriptive representation. And so afterwards, the graduate students can give comments. And so and they write them down on paper anonymously. All of the comments that came back were like, she's too confident. And so and this is, you know, I'm like, too confident? What does that mean, right? What does that mean, too confident? So I'm sitting here, like it's the first week, and I'm like, oh my God, they think I'm too confident. Well, let me start to like do things so that I'm not perceived that way. And it sounds crazy, but internally you want to do those things so that you're not marginalized and things of that nature. You want to blend in when we were called to stand out, right? So I think that there's just a lot going on. when you're a grad student and you're just trying to make it. So I don't blame grad students for not being active. They have a lot of work to do, and then there's a lot of internal things that are happening as well. I think we could probably do more to help them be active, but also recognize that there are a lot of people out here that are just trying to maintain in a lot of different kind of ways.
So do you think that hitting a wall like that, it's early in your career, you're just first few weeks, and you get comments like that, again, being traumatized, how do you think that eventually will manifest itself again, you in your later years, and in general, just graduate students in their general year, in their after years, meaning, so you hit this early, and is this a symptom of Vanderbilt? Is this a symptom of just graduate student life? Does this exist at graduate schools, for example, like at Howard University? Do you think they face these things? How does the whole enterprise of scholar activists move forward when those who are going to be part of our black intelligentsia are somehow curtailed from undertaking the struggle?
I think you just have to recognize in life, not just in graduate school, in corporate America, wherever you are, you're always going to have people hating on you. And you have to rise above and just keep being great and keep on shining, because they can't say anything when you're getting grants and you're getting other things. And so I think for me, it took me 2 years to realize how damaging that comment was to my productivity. Because I found myself saying things like, I don't want to be too confident, let me not, I don't want to be perceived as this, let me not. And it probably wasn't until my second year when I ended up getting my NSF that I was like, they tried it. They really tried it. And so then after that, it was just a matter of learning how to put that comment to the side and recognize what they were trying to do in that moment was to diminish and rising above it. And I think that's not just for people that are in grad school. I think that's for people like anywhere in life. And so anytime somebody has something to say, in part, know that it's probably because you're doing something good. So keep on shining. Shine on the haters. So Beyonce said.
I want to jump into that. And when I was doing my PhD at Bowling Green State University in the 70s, actually, dating myself, James Baldwin came to campus. And there had been some crazy stuff on campus. You can imagine the little Bowling Green. Baldwin was a writer in residence. And all of us, we thought Baldwin was coming to save us. Like, save us, I mean, literally. But I think about that when I think about whether it's Dean Towns or Professor Whiting or Professor McGee, colleagues here, and the fact that so much of the time black students in programs really do need these mentors, but these mentors are also dealing with a myriad of things. And the whole question for me is one of fatigue. Fatigue on the part of the young people who are persisting, but fatigue on the part of the elders who are trying to hold it down and do everything the institution wants them to do, but also, and their scholarly work and all of that, but also take care of these young folk who many times are really quite needy. And so for me, the other question is fatigue. And I don't know what you do with that other than the fact that it's real. And so I think that that's something we have to think about in institutions like this one on both sides, the graduate students, but also people like yourself, Dean Brunson, and others who are dealing with that and trying to create community and keep these folk here so they can persist.
Are there any questions from anyone in the audience? Dr. Whiting, you look like there's something that you want
I just sit here because I don't want to sit. I don't look slouching. Okay. Yeah, I'll say something. So before I started back on my journey to do my PhD, and I think that, and mind you that I can't get inside the head of every white person, brown person, whatever, however you want to codify yourself, and say that the process of going through any program, master's, PhD, or whatever, is going to be easy for anybody. So let's first say that it's not easy. But there are additional hurdles, I think, that we talk about that black and brown and women go through during these processes. Prior to me beginning it, I was a military officer. And there was this time when we just got tired of being in the field. We got tired of battle or battle fatigue. And I think we can use that kind of notion when we think about the processes that we go through to accomplish this thing, only to get to a point to where we hope we get a job, only to get to a point where we get the job and we hope to get a tenure-track job, only to get the tenure-track job and hope we get tenure, only to hope we get tenure and find out that 7, 8 years into our thing, we're worried about being full. And then we get full, and then now you're finally part of the crew, and guess what? You've lost who you were when you were in your graduate work. So, and a lot of it is, you know, you run up against a wall and it stops you here and it pushes you back. Before you know, you're running down this tube that's very, very narrow, and you don't have any space to express yourself. So I think that fatigue that we talk about, I think starts there. But I think where the activism can come in, particularly with graduate students, is to know that, write about your experience. Keep that there so that you can share it with other folks. Think about that when you become a professor and you're dealing with a graduate student. I think there's more formative information that you can get for the summative end, if you will. So there's summative, and it feeds you what you're going to learn down the road. And I think right now we have a lot of folks who are, for some reason, think that they're the only one. We look at some of the programs, the average PhD in most places, 6 to 10 years, and depending on the major you're in, it could be longer than that. We're still down in the 1 to 2% ratio of those who actually complete the degree. So by no means and no stretch of imagination is it easy. Never mind even getting into a place. I guarantee everybody in this audience who has gone through the master's or PhD program can tell you about the struggles that they've had and how we assess those, how we got where we are. And it's for us to try to help those, I think, who are coming now to say that, you know, how can I make this normalized, right? And now we're also bombarded with the fact that we have, I asked my daughter, I said, you ever heard this saying, ignorance is what? And she says, bliss. I said, so what's the opposite of ignorance? She said, intelligence. So what's the opposite of bliss? You know, so the more you know, you're bombarded with all of these images and all of this information that's out there. Now you get to a point where in your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, now it's time for you to do something. You can't keep saying that somebody older is going to handle this thing. It's up to you to handle it. Just your time to lead. I don't know, you're not old enough yet. But, no, I'm saying, let me finish what I'm going to say before you start blaming me for ageism.
Her youth and glowing skin.
What I'm going to say is that Martin Luther King and a lot of these folks were basically assassinated by the time they were, you know, they were already gone. You know, 39 years old and all that. You know, they didn't live a very long time, but during the time that they lived, there was so much going on and so much to fight for. What is it that we're fighting for today, and how do we get that, you know? We can talk about the Black Panther Party and what they do in terms of all the stuff they brought to America as well with regards to graduate students and their interaction, but that was a timed thing there. So I was telling one of the graduate students I work with all the time, I said, my little forms of protest is I'll wear a shirt every now and again that says something that's controversial. You know, that's where I protest, you know, each one teach one. And I got a picture of a little black male with a black man over him or something like that. And it's subtle, but it's there. And those are the kind of things we do, or we look at the research and we actually start to change our undergraduates' minds so that then when they become graduate students or become professors, they will live that tradition as well.
Okay. Thank you very much to our panel. Our time is up. We have about a minute and a half left, but I do want to thank our audience and definitely thank our panelists for joining us and sharing their perspectives on these issues, 50 years of struggle. And as a token of the graduate school appreciation, I have this for you.
Thanks, Frank.